In 1985, Nintendo released the Nintendo Entertainment System, and in so doing released a platformer that would reign over all others for years to come. Super Mario Bros. Would go on to become the highest-selling game of all time until Wii Sports superseded it, at least if you include system pack-in copies, and spawned countless sequels, the 1993 theatrical film No One Wants to Remember, 2 animated series, spin-off franchises like Mario Kart, Happy Meal tie-ins, the payoff for an entire film, and more. It was a bona fide cultural sensation. But also in 1985, Sega released the Master System. It did pretty well in Europe and South America, but failed to really ignite in the key markets of Japan and North America the way the NES did. There are a lot of reasons for this, from the timing of each region's launch to the off-cited dearth of games. But one way or another, Sega executives decided that among the failures they wanted to address with the launch of their Sega Genesis console was the addition of a platforming mascot to rival Nintendo's Plumber. Now, this is just a casual observation, but there seems to be this theory in marketing circles about how an up-and-coming competitor should take on entrenched products. For example, Coke attempts to embed their brand into the fabric of Americana, with advertisements painted by Norman Rockwell, carefully arranged product placement at key events and shows like American Idol or Disney parks, and warm paintings of Santa Claus. Coke wants people to associate its brand with any sort of a good time, from holidays to sports. To counter that image of old-fashioned and forever-loved ubiquity, Pepsi differentiates itself as the younger, hipper beverage. From Ray Charles and Uh-Huh in the 90s to Britney Spears at the turn of the century to Elton John and Flava Flav today, the idea is to make Coke look antiquated and Pepsi look, well, cool. You see the same thing in other places. Burger King has these absurdist advertisements with creepy kings and Hard Rock chickens, while McDonald's establishes itself as a beloved restaurant chain you have a personal relationship with. Even Microsoft tried to do this with surprising success when muscling in against the more entrenched Sony and Nintendo. They branded their console with the extreme name of Xbox, went with a decidedly then-hip do-the-do color scheme, and placed an emphasis on shooters instead of cuddly platformer mascots. And I think this idea of marketing yourself as younger, edgier, and hipper in order to take on a more established competitor at least kind of informed the creation of Sonic the Hedgehog. He was created not just as a character in his own right, but as a counterpoint to Mario. He had slick running shoes in an era where kids were getting shot over having the coolest sneakers. His spikes gave him a harder, tougher look than the bubbly, rounded edges of Mario. And unlike the generally chipper Mario, Sonic carried a bit of an attitude. He didn't want to wait for the player, tapping his foot and crossing his arms whenever the player didn't give him input. His title screen has him smirking and giving an "oh no you didn't" hand gesture. And once he has all the Chaos Emeralds, he can effectively go Super Saiyan and be a hedgehog demigod wreaking vengeance on the enemies of nature. I wouldn't go so far as to call him badass, but he was created with harsher edges to give him a greater appeal to a cynical 90s youth. And in trying to market Sonic as cool, they gave him another attribute that would, in my opinion, haunt the franchise for years. Sonic was, purportedly at least, all about speed. Now, I'd argue they had 2 reasons to make this claim, both of which were aimed at hurting Nintendo. The first was that it further subverted the Mario character, painting him as slow and stodgy by comparison. And the second was to emphasize the hardware's capabilities. Sonic wasn't just fast because he was cool, he was fast because he was on the Genesis. Remember these ads?
So what's blast processing do? What if you don't have blast processing?
But if you've ever played the original Sonic games, it's pretty clear after the first zone that they're not about speed. Not really. Yes, Sonic possessed the capability to move really quickly, and in a few areas you could really build up speed. But outside of the first zone where building up speed is easy, and a few spring-loaded segments like the chemical plant pipes, it isn't emphasized. Next to the moving fast segments are block-pushing puzzles, boss fights that take up literally a single screen and involve very little movement at all, timing puzzles where waiting and patience is key, slow-paced moving platform rides, and bonus stages where you fall in a rotating gem world. It wasn't until Sonic CD that a mechanic that was about speed was even introduced, where you could travel backwards or forwards in time by reaching certain points of the map at top speed. I mean, think of it this way. Ever since Super Mario Bros. On the NES, the level timer in 2D Mario games ticked down until his death, giving Mario and the player a mechanical impetus to go fast. In contrast, Sonic's timer ticked up, seemingly infinitely. Sonic, despite having a great capacity for speed, could take his sweet time doing, whatever. My point is that just because Sonic can move fast doesn't mean that the games are about Sonic moving fast. I mean, TF2's Heavy can eat a sandwich, but that doesn't mean the game is about lunch. But just because the games weren't about speed doesn't mean they were bad. The music was incredible throughout the series and showed what the often maligned Genesis sound chip was capable of. The games had a distinct visual style with an emphasis on sharp geometric shapes and patterns. While this was sort of a hip style at the time, think Trapper Keepers, the aesthetic also tied well into the underlying theme of the conflict between technology and nature, with Robotnik's attempts to turn animals into robots set in a world where nature looked half artificial to begin with. Best of all, unlike the other copycat platformers, it felt appreciably different from Mario to play. Sonic had a sense of heft and momentum about him that Mario generally lacked. Mario would be at max speed within a second of holding down the run button, but Sonic had to use jumps, hills, and springs to propel him forward faster and faster, and in later games he could stop to rev himself up. God, I still love doing that. Mario had a bit of momentum, but his levels were mostly flat plains that emphasized enemy avoidance and careful jumps. But Sonic's levels were all about momentum control across hills and valleys, dips and climbs, loop-de-loops and corkscrews. The result was that even though the game was a 2D platformer with a cute, marketing-friendly mascot like Mario, Sonic definitely had his own identity. Not just as an edgier, hipper protagonist than Mario, but also a mechanical identity wholly distinct from what Mario was offering. If Mario's emphasis was tight, skilled jumps, Sonic was all about the flow of movement and the gain, loss, and control of speed, where going fast was as much a liability as it was a superpower. The franchise enjoyed the success of 3 major releases, a well-received expansion pack, a fantastic Sega CD offering, and a host of okay spin-offs. But by the mid-90s, times had changed, rather drastically. The whole world was moving into the third dimension, and a lot of game properties were either struggling to figure out how to make the transition or being left behind outright. And once Super Mario 64 hit in 1996 and became a mega success, there was no going back. If Sonic was to compete as the younger, hipper platformer in this brave new world, he'd have to do so in 3D. To make things even more complicated, there was now an even younger, even hipper, even edgier mascot to compete with: Crash Bandicoot. This put Sega in an awkward position where they weren't really sure what to do with Sonic, and from 1994 until 1999 we didn't see much of him. He only had 2 original games on the Saturn, a racing game and an isometric platformer. Neither received particularly warm receptions, and neither could really be considered a mainline Sonic game any more than Mario RPG or Mario Kart could be considered a follow-up to Super Mario World. Then came the Dreamcast, and news of a 3D Sonic that was supposed to be to Sonic what Mario 64 was to the Mario games. It didn't really work out that way. Mario 64 had to completely reinvent how Mario worked for the more complex 3D environments, adding a health bar, toning down to raw platforming in favor of a bigger emphasis on exploration, and making the levels about achieving a goal rather than simply reaching the end of a linear track. Unfortunately, Sonic Team decided to go in the exact opposite direction, leaving the sprawling levels from Sonic 3 and Knuckles behind in favor of narrow, linear paths. But most critically, when reinventing the game for 3D, Sonic Team believed their own marketing mantra that Sonic was about speed. They not only increased how fast Sonic could move, but made high-velocity movement alone the core focal point of the gameplay. 3D Sonic wasn't slower and more forgiving, it was faster and way more lethal. Combined with the added complexities of navigating a 3D environment and late 90s third-person camera issues, and the game was always going to be more frustrating than fun. In a 2D platforming game, an emphasis on raw speed is manageable because you're only headed in one direction, left or right. The player's focus is on controlling how fast they're going and where they are on the screen vertically through jumps. This is the focus of games like Cannonball. But in 3D, the difference between blasting off in this direction and this direction might well mean your doom, especially when you're also trying to time your jump right or make sure the path ahead is clear. There's no time for correction, and every tilt of the analog stick becomes potentially instantly fatal. And, hard platformers are fine, but usually steps are taken to mitigate the frustration the difficulty can provide. Short levels, or at least frequent checkpoints, minimal reset times, and unlimited lives can all make a game challenging without being aggravating. Sonic Adventure did, and modern 3D Sonic still mostly does, none of those things. Sonic Adventure also marked the beginning of Sonic's plague of animal friends. Sonic's always had a growing roster of sidekicks, picking up Tails in Sonic 2, Knuckles in Sonic 3, and Amy in Sonic CD. But at a certain point, the oversaturation just became too much. Until Sonic Adventure, they were just background noise or variations on the core momentum-driven platformer mechanics. Here, though, they take up 5/6 of the game and are an active detriment to whatever small joy you might find in the core Sonic platforming. And honestly, I don't think the animal friends signify the decline of Sonic just because they were obnoxiously lazy anthropomorphic animals that had paper-thin personalities. Instead, I think they heralded a Sonic franchise that had no idea what to do with itself outside of Sonic Goes Fast. So instead, it filled the void with random sidekicks and game modes for the next decade. In short, Sonic was a game franchise in search of a game mechanic to call its own. Things reached their nadir with Sonic the Hedgehog 2006. It was that moment where you hadn't seen the franchise in a while, and then you see it and you just realize it had completely let itself go. It had perhaps the worst aesthetic for a Sonic game ever, with realistic human characters in urban settings next to Sonic and pals. And it was nigh unplayable due to game-breaking bugs, atrocious load times, and gameplay that clearly wasn't play-tested. The open platforming was a million times worse than Sonic Adventure ever was, full of lava pits that meant instant death for no reason, and the open platforming segments are totally undercut by both the movement mechanics that want you to go top speed, as well as level design that completely fails to direct the player in where they need to go. And when they finally let you get up to speed, everything in this game is crazy lethal. Everything hurts you and takes all your rings. Everything. You can't even really run around and pick the rings you spill back up since the segment forces you to always move forward. Sure, it's Sonic being fast, but it's fast in the dumbest, most broken way possible. It wasn't until Sonic Unleashed that the series began to understand how an ultra-fast Sonic could work in 3D. And even then, 3D Sonic only accounted for about a third of the game. Another third was solving banal open-world adventure and platforming puzzles, and another third was spent as a tensionless, monotonous God of War ripoff, where Sonic turns into a werewolf and wails on enemies with super stretchy arms. Honestly, everyone had stopped expecting Sonic to make sense like 6 games ago, so... Okay, so I'm not selling you on this, but despite that, it fixed a lot of the problems that had been plaguing the series. Not all the problems, but most. It was ultimately playable and even fun, which is something I couldn't say for Sonic 2006. The game gets rid of a lot of the more open platforming that was contrary to Sonic's newfound emphasis on speed, and instead pushes the player forward on a tighter, narrower series of tracks. The behind-the-shoulder segments take place mostly on flat, open terrain, where the direction of jumping is less important than the lateral movement and timing of the jump. It brings the gameplay back to the idea of focusing on movement around one axis instead of two, and provides an incredible sense of speed while minimizing the impact of the third dimension. And instead of forcing every analog stick input to imply you mean to go at Mach 6 like Sonic Adventure, and instead of relying on boost pads or QuickTime events to get you up to speed like Sonic 2006, the player is given a ring power mechanic that quickly accelerates the player to regain lost momentum. Think of it as a modern version of revving, which works instantaneously in the middle of a run so long as you have a few rings. It keeps the idea of insane speed, but places the control of that speed back in the player's hands. This allows for manageable small-scale movement in cities and other cramped environments, while still providing the capability of Sonic to go crazy sound barrier breaking fast. When trickier jumping is required, the game pulls back to 2 dimensions and slows down a bit. It's not quite the same platforming of the 16-bit glory days, but it shows the thought that was put into the design, changing the pace of the gameplay and allowing the player the visibility into their location needed to make harder platforming possible. The balance of these two gameplay modes is helped by the fact that the only things that can hurt you now are what hurt you in the original Sonic, enemies and bottomless pits. Combined with a more refined scoring system, the game became less about whether you finished and more about how you finished. Did you take the fastest path? Did you grab as many rings possible? Chasing S ranks was now akin to trying to get 5 stars in Guitar Hero. It wasn't about finishing the song or the level, but finishing it as close to perfectly as possible using twitchy fingers and rote memorization. Maybe it wasn't as accessible as the early Sonics, but there's definitely an enjoyable game buried in there. A lot of people dismissed it because of the awful other 2/3 of the game, but if nothing else, Sonic Unleashed was seminal in the Sonic canon for establishing how you can make these ideas of raw speed work on a modern game console. Sonic Colors went on to refine a lot of these mechanics, but it was Sonic Generations that is probably the perfect culmination of everything Sonic has been for the past 2 decades. The game included 2 Sonics, complete with their respective gameplay styles, both the modern post-Unleashed Sonic as well as the 2D Sonic from the 16-bit era. Best of all, it was only these 2 Sonics. You don't play as friends or relatives or sidekicks or Robotnik or anything like that. And I gotta say, these 2 gameplay styles actually complement each other really well. Modern Sonic brings the legend of the ultra-fast Sonic to life, blazing across a few tracks at a million miles an hour. Meanwhile, 2D Sonic feels just like we left him, a 2D platformer where we want to obtain and lose momentum with the ebb and flow of our play. It's sort of like being able to play a stealth game as both Agent 47 from Hitman and a modern Sam Fisher, or to race across a racetrack as both a Forza car and a Burnout car. It's 2 flavors of the same concept that contrast and compare in really interesting ways, and both of them are at this point surprisingly engaging and mature mechanically. If I was forced to choose, I'd still probably prefer the 2D Sonic, if only because there are fewer nonsense deaths and blind jumps. But I'd be lying if I said I didn't see the appeal of a super fast rote memorization platformer that looks really slick and rewards skilled play with a sense of flow that's comparable to keeping a combo alive in Tony Hawk. After a decade of dead ends and lazy mechanics, I'd argue that 3D Sonic has come into his own and can stand beside his 2D self. Which brings us to Sonic 4. In 2010, before the release of Sonic Generations, Sega attempted to resurrect the 2D franchise in the same way it brought Sonic into 3D, by blindly taking what was already there and slapping it onto then-hip packaging. In 1999, it was 3D games post Mario 64, which resulted in Sonic Adventure. And in 2010, it was 2D games in the wake of New Super Mario Bros. And indie successes like Braid that culminated in a follow-up to all the 2D Sonics. And it was bad. Not awful, definitely not Sonic 2006 bad, but it was a bit of a Frankenstein's monster, an amalgamation of the auto-targeting necessary in the 3D Sonics to drive players down a specific path, along with floaty momentum-based physics controls that made following those paths extraordinarily difficult. The end result was a game that felt like what it was, a cash-in on a trend. It couldn't capture the essence of traditional 2D Sonic the way Sonic Generations would a year later, and instead felt like a 2D imitation of 3D Sonic the way Sonic Adventure felt like an awkward imitation of 2D Sonic. And ironically, this is where the Hedgehog rests in 2012, with a set of 3D mechanics that's slowly becoming more robust, and a 2D Sonic that's completely forgotten what worked in the first place. If there's any lessons to be learned from all this, it's that there's a serious, appreciable difference between the complexities of 3-dimensional and 2D gameplay. 3D games, by their nature, need to be more forgiving of player input because players are going to make more mistakes in a more complicated environment. It's why platforming in Super Meat Boy can be super precise, but Assassin's Creed has to be generous with player input. And why Doom has a health meter when Contra doesn't. And why 3D Zeldas need to have a lock-on mechanism while 2D Zeldas don't. It also teaches us that the mechanics that make a game work might not always be the ones that are popularly perceived. It took a decade of trial and error before we got a Sonic game that was actually about speed, and I'm still not convinced it ever really had to be. In some sense, Marble Blast 3D will always be, at least to me, the true successor to the Sonic I grew up with. The marbles carry weight, and you can spin dash, and collect multicolored emeralds, and the entire game is about platforming by controlling your momentum and speed while trying to finish in the fastest time possible. In a very real way, this is Sonic 3D. And while I've slowly come to appreciate this ultra-fast blue streak of a hedgehog that modern Sonic has turned into, I think it's based more off a marketing meme than an actual mechanic.